Revenant is the invincible Warframe. We all know that, right? But what if I told you that he also dishes out so much damage that he can one-hit any enemy in the game, even at level cap, including overguarded Eximus units? That's right. In today's guide, I'm gonna show you what Revenant is truly capable of. I have quite some builds prepared, so after big kisses to all my generous channel members who help me keep the lights on, let's jump right into it. And jumping in we do, with of course the first thing that we always take a look at when we're talking about Warframe guides, and that would be Revenant's skills. First off, yes, he does have a passive, but this passive is completely irrelevant to what we're about to do today, so let's just skip right over it and go into his actual abilities. His one goes by the name Enthrall. The way this works is kind of like Nyx's mind control. You shoot it at an enemy, and then this enemy will sort of switch sides and work together with you against their brothers and sisters. But not just that, the enemy will also spread this enthrall effect to nearby enemies by attacking them automatically. So all you need to do really is shoot it at one enemy, wait a little bit, and then the effect will automatically spread out over time. The downside here, unfortunately, is you cannot have infinite thralls on the field. I think the maximum was 7 thralls at any given time, and in and of itself, this is a nice little ability to cause a bit of turmoil among the enemies. But that's not all, because Enthrall does have an augment called Thrall Pact, and this one is actually pretty interesting. What this does is, it gives a base damage bonus to your primary weapon for every thrall that you currently have on the field. By default, that's just 25%, but given enough ability strength, you can amass a crap load of base damage, so this is quite relevant. Ability number 2 is Revenant's bread and butter and the skill that he's so well known for, Mesmer Skin. I don't think I have to explain all too much here, so I'm gonna make it short. Mesmer Skin gives you a couple of stacks that you can see in the bottom right corner, and whenever you receive a hit by an enemy, you don't take any damage, but instead you lose a stack and the enemy that is attacking you will get stunned. The cool thing about this is that Mesmer Skin does not care about how much damage this shot would have actually done. So no matter if you're being hit by a level 1 enemy or by a level 10,000 enemy, you always only lose 1 stack, and this is why Revenant is such a survivable Warframe. Now, Mesmer Skin also has an augment called Mesmer Shield, and whether this one is great or to be skipped completely depends on what team setup you're running. Oh yeah, and at the same time, you get more Mesmer Skin strength, meaning you need less ability strength on Revenant for the same amount of Mesmer Skin stacks. Ability number 3, Reave. Alright, now Reave, as you also saw in the intro, is the skill that we're going to be talking about a lot in today's video, because it's just incredibly busted, super strong, and I think most of the community really sleeps on this one. What it does is pretty simple. You dash forward as a sort of cloud wall, and every enemy touched by this will lose a certain percentage of their maximum health. That's right, it doesn't do a fixed amount of damage like most skills, instead it reduces the enemy's maximum health, so also here, no matter if you're fighting a level 1 or level 1000 enemy, the portion of health lost will always be the same. Now, there is a certain synergy in that if you Reave through enthralled enemies, you gain stacks for your Mesmer Skin back, but as we will see for the builds in today's video, this is not really relevant, so I simply wanted to mention it here for completion's sake. And now that we're at it, before we go on to his 4th ability, there is one more thing that I need to tell you about Reave. On the info panel for the ability, it shows a percentage value of exactly how many % of health the enemies will lose. However, what the game doesn't tell you is, this percentage value only applies to those enemies that you have enthralled, because they take more damage if you Reave through them. Every enemy that you haven't enthralled, though, will take way less. So even though you have 100% there, doesn't mean you're one-hitting everything. And now, finally, let's talk about his 4th ability, which is at the same time the one skill that really rewards me for having slogged through 4 years of French class in school, because now I can properly pronounce it. It's called Danse Macabre, and if you ask me, this is actually pretty good. Danse Macabre is an AoE damage dealing ability. You start floating, spinning around your own axis, and dealing damage to all the enemies around you. Now, the cool thing about this ability is that it detects which element the enemy that you're currently hitting is weak against and adapts to that, so that no matter who you hit, you're always going to deal that damage type that the certain faction is weakest against. As for the damage, it's actually pretty good, and if you want to amp it up even more, you can hold down the left mouse button while you're in the animation, and then you burn more energy but also deal more damage. And as if that's not enough, there is more weird shenanigans, and that is that this skill has a capped range, so with Danse Macabre you can theoretically go and mod into negative range without being punished for it at all. Okay, now so much for the skills, relatively straightforward I think, and before we get into the one-hit build that I showed you in the intro, I also want to present to you some alternative ways to play Revenant that I think would also resonate with quite a lot of players out there. And as always, if you could spare a like for UncleBlacky, the YouTube algorithm likes it. Thank you so much for your support. Now, the first way of playing Revenant that I want to talk about is the classical Gunrunner. Here, we utilize Revenant's insane survivability by turning him into a weapons platform that is basically just meant to stay alive against whatever you're facing and do a bit of buffing at the same time so that you can deal the main portion of your damage with your primary weapon. Since his survivability comes from his Mesmer skin, and the amount of Mesmer skin charges that we get depends on the ability strength, we want to make sure to have as much ability strength as possible. That's why in this one, I go with Umbral Intensify, Power Drift in the Exilus, Blind Rage for a fat plus 99% on top, and Transient Fortitude as well as Augur Secrets to get that to over 300%. This should give us a nice amount of charges for Mesmer skin and help with survivability. Then, also very important, we're gonna go with the Thrall Pact augment because, as I already said, depending on how much ability strength you have, this will give you a very significant amount of base damage bonus for your primary weapon, and it is very noticeable. To have that on as long as possible, we go for a lot of duration with Prime Continuity and Narrow-Minded. In terms of energy, we go for Arcane Energize and Prime Flow. And to top it off, we have another little step to buff our guns even further, and that would be Combat Discipline in the Aura together with Arcane Avenger. As we all know, Arcane Avenger is a great arcane to boost up our crit chance into very high levels. However, you need to take damage either against your shield or against your health in order to activate it, and with Mesmer skin, we don't take any damage. Therefore, we need Combat Discipline so that we hurt ourselves every time we kill an enemy and therefore activate Arcane Avenger. Just one thing to mention here, as long as you have Mesmer skin on, you cannot kill yourself with Combat Discipline. Your health could go down to 10 or even lower HP, but don't worry about it, you're not gonna die as long as you have Mesmer skin. Just please make sure that you don't have any damage over time effects on enemies while you're recasting Mesmer skin, because it can actually happen that an enemy dies through damage over time effects while you're in the recasting animation of Mesmer skin, so you're not protected, and then when the enemy dies, Combat Discipline kicks in, reduces your health to 0, and then you actually die. But with a little bit of attention, this shouldn't be all too much of a problem. This right here would be the Gunrunner build that I like to use, and while it certainly is not on the same level with other dedicated weapon platform frames like Harrow or Saren for example, it's still pretty good in terms of gun buffing, and of course you have Revenant's incredible survivability. If you want to, you could even use a Helminth ability, like for example Rhino's Roar, to buff up your damage output even further. Another build that I also want to showcase because I think it's severely underrated is the one focusing on his fourth ability, Danse Macabre, and especially among Steel Path players, this is kind of a bit frowned upon, people like to replace his 4 with a Helminth ability because they say the damage simply can't keep up, but for the standard Steel Path level ranges until level 300-ish, this is actually pretty fine. As I also said in the skill section, Danse Macabre scales with ability strength. The more strength you have, the more damage it does. But on the other hand, you also want to balance strength and duration, because if those two values are too low, then your Danse Macabre is going to burn through so much energy that you simply can't keep it up. Here is how I built. For the strength, I went for Growing Power in the Aura, giving us 25% more ability strength when our weapon deals a status effect. That shouldn't be too difficult. Then, Transient Fortitude, giving us more ability strength at the cost of a bit of duration, Augur Secrets, and then, one of the newer mods, Precision Intensify. This one gives 90% ability strength, but only to our 4th ability, because the 4th is Danse Macabre, and that is what we're focusing on. And finally, to top it off, Power Drift in the Exilus and Mold Augmented in the Arcane slot, giving us a really big chunk of strength. Prime Continuity for more duration, Prem Flow and Arcane Energize for the energy economy, and Fleeting Expertise to give us more efficiency, so we're most likely not going to have any problems with our energy. Now, this build is definitely really strong, especially against unarmored enemies. However, in Steel Path, the toughest foes are usually the ones with the thick armor, and against those we're kinda struggling because the armor just absorbs so much of our damage. That's why, with this build, we're forced to have an armor stripping ability, therefore I use the Helmet ability to infuse Necros' Terrify. As I said in the skill section, Danse Macabre does not scale with range when it comes to how much range the actual skill has. That's why usually you can get away with negative ability range. Unfortunately, Necros' Terrify does in fact need range. That's why, to top off the entire build, I went for Stretch and Overextended to give us the range for Terrify so we can strip all the enemy armor around us. This is the full build, and as you also see in the background, once the armor is gone, it melts away everything. Bonus points if you run it with a Panzerwölfe Pfeiler as your companion, because it can spread viral in the entire room, which then amplifies your damage even further. But alright, in the intro I promised you a build that can one-hit everything, and a build that can one-hit everything you will get. Let's look into it. As I mentioned in the skill section in the beginning of the video, Revenant's third skill Reave doesn't deal a fixed amount of damage, instead it reduces the enemy's health by a certain percentage. This means if we manage to buff this skill up so high that we get to 100% health reduction, it can one-shot any enemy no matter how strong. This is exactly what we're gonna do. Now, since the procedure of getting so much ability strength is a bit lengthy, let's first go over the other mods. Survivability naturally comes from Mesmer skin, so we don't need to think about that any further. Our energy economy is going to work with Arcane Energize and Prime Flow, and in order to hit as many enemies as possible with Reave, we also want to mod for a bit of range, because the more range we have, the broader this cloud wall that we turn into will be, and therefore the more enemies we hit with it. I went for Stretch for plus 45% range, and then the Augment mod, Blinding Reave, because it gives another plus 40% range to reach, which is 10% more than Augur Reach that we would have used alternatively. Now, time to get into the nitty-gritty. In order for Reave to be able to one-shot every enemy, not only the enthralled ones, we need a whole lot of ability strength. In total, 550%. So let's jump into it by first looking at the mods and the build itself. Growing Power in the Aura for plus 25% on weapon status effect, Power Drift in the Exilus for a little bit on top, Umbral Intensify, Transient Fortitude, Blind Rage, Augur Secret, and Mold Augmented to give us the full broadside of modded ability strength, and unfortunately this is a very high investment, we need 5 Tau Forged Red Archon Shards, all into ability strength for another plus 75%. Unfortunately here, I've run the tests, it is definitely necessary to have 5 Tau Forged, because even if you only were to replace one of them with the normal variant, you would not have enough strength to one-hit every enemy. But still, even with all those mods, the Mold Augmented Arcane, and 5 Archon Shards, we are still unfortunately not at 550%. Up next, we're going to take a look at our secondary weapon, which will have to be the Grimoire. Now, the way you build your Grimoire is actually not all that important. The only thing that does matter is use the One Tome mod that gives you more ability strength depending on how many enemies you hit with the Alt Fire of the Grimoire. This can easily get you another plus 60% ability strength. And now, what we have to do as our final step is infuse Rhino's Roar with the Helmet system, because the damage bonus from Rhino's Roar applies not only to weapons, but as we know, also to abilities, meaning also to Revenant's Reave. All we really need to do is go into the mission, shoot the Alt Fire of the Grimoire once to activate the 60% buff, and then activate our Roar. Roar then snapshots all the ability strength buffs that we had at the point where we casted it, and even if they run out afterwards, as long as Roar is on, it will have this big damage bonus percentage. And this build is constructed exactly in a way that the only thing you really need is this buffed up Roar, and then afterwards you don't need anything. No growing power anymore, no Grimoire buff anymore, you can just reave through everything on just the Roar alone. All you need to do is fire the Grimoire's Alt Fire once Roar runs out, and then you can go again for another like 40 seconds or so. Now, to be fair, there is one downside to it. While it can one-shot normal enemies and even over-guarded Eximus units, it unfortunately cannot one-hit kill Acolytes. But then on the other hand, you're Invincible Revenant with a Roar buff of over 100%, so all you really need to do for the Acolytes is bring, for example, a strong melee weapon. Like in my case, I used the Hate in a heavy attack build. and then you inflict 1 or 2 slashes onto them, and they will just absolutely explode. But I hear you say, Blacky, how can you seriously demand we just throw 5 Tau Forged Archon shards out the window for a simple Revenant build? And I totally get that. That is also why I have a budget option for you that also does the one-hit killing, just with much less investment, even though in turn it needs a bit more setup. See, the reason why we needed that much ability strength on the previous build is because I wanted to keep it as easy to play as possible, where you don't need a lot of setup. In reality though, you actually don't need 550% ability strength, you just need to put a little bit of viral into the mix to make the enemies more susceptible to damage, and then 300% ability strength will be enough for the one hit. Pretty easy to do. Growing power in the aura, together with Blind Rage, Transient Fortitude, Augur Secrets, and Umbral Intensify. Then some efficiency with Fleeting Expertise, some range with Stretch, and continuity for a little bit of duration. With this build, you can also go and one-shot enemies just on Reave alone. However, I should mention at this point, with this budget setup and the lower ability strength, they do require 10 viral procs on them, otherwise you're not going to do enough damage. If you wanted to, you could also use the Grimoire with it to get 60% more ability strength and therefore have a bit more headroom when it comes to the modding. And also one big recommendation from my side, use the Panzerwalpe as your companion because it is very good to spread room-wide viral effects, and therefore it synergizes extremely well with this build that requires viral to be present on all the enemies. This right here is the full build. I do admit with the viral it's a bit more setup, but it's the closest we can get to the one-hit build, at least on lower types of investment. By the way, have I ever mentioned that Reave is even his helmet ability? Yep, that's right, you can put it on any other Warframe as well. And if you want to know the best helmet options in the entire game, then don't miss my ultimate helmet tier list right here. Another big shout out to Niels V, Demon Nortzel, Demon Emperor, Emperor Prime, Nostlinix Gaming, Lycan Shepherd, Turtlepeer, Shadow Soul, Pepperwolf, Ondakanio2, Misfire DX, and all other generous channel members for your continuous support. We see each other, hopefully in the next one, and until then, as always, good loot and have a nice weekend.